Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 13 of Doses of Darling. For those of you who are new to watching or listening, welcome. My name is Darling Membreño and I am a licensed professional counselor associate here in Texas. For those of you who are continuing to watch or listen, thanks so much. I have a few new subscribers this week, which is like really exciting for me. I know that last week I kind of put out an ask. What is it called? A call to action for y'all to comment and let me know what kinds of things y'all are curious to know about mental health or therapy or I don't know, anything that has to do with my profession and um, questions that are in your mind. Mostly everybody has decided to answer on Instagram and Facebook, which is really interesting. But I'm leaving the comment section open. If there's no possibility of commenting on Spotify or Apple or Amazon, whatever other platforms I'm on, definitely come on over to YouTube and comment here, or I will leave my socials in the description below so that y'all can direct message me as well and let me know what kinds of things y'all are curious about knowing. The ideas that I've gotten so far are great, and also have reiterated some of the ones that I have had up my sleeve, as I mentioned last week. So I think I'm going on the right path. I'm still praying about where to take this podcast next, and I'm receiving all the guidance already. I have other ideas that kind of sparked this week, even today. So I'm grateful for the friends that I can talk to about all of this, and super pumped about what's to come. There are so many wonderful things around the corner that are coming that I already see like are coming to fruition, and I can't wait to share. But I'm just gonna chill, pray, and wait for things to happen, and as they happen y'all will get to hear the amazing news. So let's get into what this podcast is going to be about. So this podcast is all my podcasts with guests are pre-recorded, but this one I recorded about a month ago with Dr. Deserah Telles, and we are broaching the very difficult topics that I decided to merge because somehow I thought they went hand in hand all the time. But Dr. Telles clarified substance use and trauma, what they are individually, but also clarified that they don't always go hand in hand. So I learned so much from her. She is such a down-to-earth boss babe, and I hope that y'all learn as much, if not more, than I did on these topics separately, and how they can come together, but also how they don't go together sometimes. And yeah, so she mentioned a lot of resources. Substance use, I know, can be a very difficult topic to broach, especially because it's something that impacts so many families or individuals. And so all of the resources that she mentioned are definitely going to be in the description. Most of them are national resources, so anybody in the country can access them. But because I am based out of Austin, Texas, some of the resources that I'm linking, and I will specify, but some of the resources I'm linking are Austin based. So there's going to be help all around. And don't hesitate to reach out. You know, these are some hard things to deal with, and even if you are not the person that suffers from substance use, there is also Al-Anon, which is for people who are related to people who suffer from substance use. And so, you know, we all need help, and if we can get the help somehow, then definitely take it as it comes, right? So I'm going to link all of those things in the description, and I really hope y'all enjoy this discussion with Dr. Deserah Telles. All right, everyone. On today's episode of Doses of Darling, we're going to be talking about trauma and substance use. This topic is something that's really near and dear to my heart. as a lot of the previous topics that we've broached already, because I actually grew up with uncles who were alcoholics, and also did other substances or used other substances. And I never watched them use the substances, but I heard the adults talking, when you're children, your parents or your aunts and uncles are talking about one another and whatever habits they have. And so just knowing, like growing up in the Latino community, and on my dad's side, he's one of 11 kids, and my mom's side, she's one of 7. And so there's a lot of cultural trauma that comes from that as well, right? Like the order in which you were born and whether you were parentified, and just so much that comes into trauma and substance use was that with that. I've also shared on the first couple of episodes about exes that I had that were addicts as well. I mean, y'all remember the first 2 exes that I had in high school who were both addicted to meth. And then my longest relationship was like of 7, 8 years. Also talked about his struggle with substance use and addiction. And so I think that one consumed me a little bit more. Um, and then I also talked about my relationship to alcohol when it came to relationships. So, just trying to figure out where the substance use comes from, and from a really young age, right? Like the substance use in these 2 high school boyfriends that I had were what planted the seed in me to want to become a mental health therapist, so that I could be able to nip that in the bud with adolescence once, that career took off. And y'all remember I took a detour of 11 years before I made it to this career, but I'm here now and I'm a new learner. And so wanting to learn as much about it myself and then put it out to y'all as well, so that we can all learn together how substance use and trauma kind of correlate or go hand in hand with one another. And so today we have an amazing guest with us. We have Dr. Telles. Dr. Telles is an LPC and an LCDC, which is a licensed chemical dependency counselor. She has a doctorate degree in human behavior. She is also EMDR trained therapist who utilizes cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, and also dialectical behavioral modality, so DBT. Dr. Telles is also a trained restorative justice facilitator, and she tends to incorporate restorative justices as well into her therapeutic sessions. So she's provided a number of specialized services to people dealing with really hard life experiences. So trauma being one of them, addiction, anxiety, depression, substance use, and also defiant behavior. So super impressive resume. I met Dr. Telles as part of the women's wellness workshop at Mira Mira venue on that Saturday that I talked about with Samantha Ben. So I've already had Samantha on this podcast, and she and I talked about EMDR actually. And so Dr. Theus's boss babe energy when we were at the wellness workshop is what caught my attention about her. I totally stalked her on Instagram after the event because I was inspired to show up in spaces the way that she was. She showed up at this event. It was super cool. I mean, she was one of the facilitators there also. And you inspired me for sure. And because I am in the early stages of this career and meeting women like you, it just gives me a vision of what I can become and who I can help on this journey as a healer that I've embarked on. And so I want to welcome you and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be on the podcast with me.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, especially for your kind words. That means a lot. It does, because sometimes, especially in this field, like we do things, but we never see the long term investment, right? You help somebody, but you never hear of how it impacted or something. So it means a lot, definitely hearing that. And also connecting. I'm so happy that you connected, because sometimes that's such a big fear of like we don't follow through or we don't connect just because the unknown, right? We don't know, and depending upon how we're raised, sometimes that's not what we're used to growing up. So it's definitely something to push ourselves out of. Yeah. So thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. Yeah. No, thanks again for being on. And I love that you mentioned that because I did have some hesitation before I started reaching out to people. Cause I mean, I met you before I even started the podcast. And so when I started thinking about people to have on, or whether I even wanted to do that, it was a huge hesitation for me because I was like, well, what if they don't want to show up? And then there's the like little fear of like, are we competition or are we collaborators? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we can't see each other as competition because we're all helping different groups of people. And so I love that you accepted and that we are now collaborating on this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something good to mention because I think so many people, we feel like there is competition, right? Or that's how we grow up in such a grind hustle mentality where we're trying to prove our best, do our best all the time. So I think that's something that's definitely normal. We all feel, but it's good to say it so that people know, like, you're not alone. Like, it doesn't matter how much schooling, how many degrees you got, like, you still feel it still comes, or the feelings of imposter syndrome or something like that. So I'm glad
Yeah.
that you're doing this, and stepping out on faith and going with it. Sometimes when, especially if you come, I don't know how your family upbringing is, but if you're the first one doing it and breaking ground in certain things, it's trial and error, just like going to school and pulling out them student loans, and you just go with it, like, and then however it's gonna pan out, like, that's my belief. Like, as long as, for me, God is at the forefront of mine. Like, He's gonna lead it, and that's it. I'm gonna follow along, and it's gonna happen, however it needs to happen, and when it needs to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. No, for sure. I definitely felt that I had this calling 11, 12 years ago, but he took me on this detour and we're here now. So that's all that matters. And yeah, I am one of the first few people to do anything like this in my family, let alone get a second master's degree. And I see the littles behind me doing the same stuff too. So maybe I'm a role model, maybe I'm an inspiration, but I also try to keep mentors that I can look up to, such as yourself, so that I can continue breaking cycles and just, I don't know, you're just like a really positive example for me. So thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for that.
Yeah. So I guess we can get started. The first question that I always ask my people or the guests that are on the show is how you were called into being in the mental health profession, or what inspired you to do it and how long you've been practicing.
Yeah. I want to say by accident, but there are no accidents. It is what it is. Truly growing up, I was going into law. That's where I had my idea. I had just, grown up, my upbringing, my family dynamics, very dysfunctional. So my idea was like, I need to get into the law system to become a lawyer, to help criminal defense, right? To help
Mhm.
people that I knew, who were affected in that way, or who were being affected. Sorry, I feel like I got something in my eye. Who were being affected. And it's not that they were being affected negatively, but at this young age, that's how the system, we kind of see it, right? As if it is negatively, no matter whether somebody's breaking the law or not, that comprehension doesn't take place, in certain situations. And I was from, East Austin before gentrification. Um, Grew up in a low income home, my grandmother's home. So it was very, just the dynamics of what my reality was to what the reality outside in the world was very different. So I had this idea I was going to go into law, and praying about it. Even my undergraduate is in like business management, like, and then I wanted to transfer, like, I was dual majoring in political science, and it just shifted. I got pregnant with my daughter, and I came, like, I always knew God and knew, but I came to Christ, and right after I had her, I was a junior in college, and I just was like, I need to do more. It was no longer I was no longer chasing the money. Like, I wanted to be a lawyer because in my head, doctor and lawyer, you're gonna make the bread.
Mhm.
Although I know that's not true, they still struggle too. It's not, but this idea, right? These assumptions that I had. So once I made this just big shift after I finished. I had to finish my degree. I was just too far in to change at that point. I felt like, so I finished my business management degree. Um, and counseling just kept falling in my lap. Social work fell into my lap, and I was just like, finally found like an LPC program at a Christian university, and I just applied, and I did things very much living in that survival mode. I did a lot of things on the whim. And what I mean by that is, even when I applied to college, I applied to one college and then I applied to the Marines. And I was like, if I don't get in this one college, God, I'm ready to go to war. Like I'm ready.
Wow.
I just, that was my mentality. Like it was kind of like, I'm ready. I'll go serve the country. And it was very irrational, very survivor mentality.
Mm.
Because I felt, I know I can succeed in that realm. I knew I could succeed in that realm. I didn't know how much I could succeed in the college realm, right?
Mm.
Once you bring me in more white spaces or more professional settings, the me slips up all the time. I have this talk all the time, but so finally, anyways, fast forward. Once I ended up finishing my degree at Liberty University and got connected. And my first I went into was substance use. I did some work at domestic violence shelters, and I connected with everything. That's where I think my heartstrings got pulled on to where, like, okay, this is exactly where I belong, because it was no longer for the external money, right? I'm not chasing this idea of what it is, but I'm more chasing like the impact on people's lives and helping people. And my motto is like, I try to be who I needed when I was younger.
Mm.
So that's a
Yeah.
lot of what I live by, decisions I make, partnerships anything that I do, I try to, leave that footprint.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with this. I love when my guests give like little doses of themselves like that, because I get to learn so much more about you too. I try to do a little bit of research here and there to include in the introduction, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
so awesome to hear your journey, to hear that you came to Christ. My first episode, and I try to mention it I weave it in almost every single episode about how I'm just sending whatever message God wants me to send to whomever it is. I'm not really in this for like the numbers and whatever.
Yeah.
If I reach one person with this episode or with whatever episodes I put out, that's like the work that I want to do, and it's great that you mentioned that you came to Christ, and that this career has been put in your life regardless, and even though I could see you, because of your boss babe energy, could totally see you as a boss ass Marine as well. That would have been a super cool route, but I'm glad that God placed you where you needed to be, so that
Mm-hmm.
then you could follow this route that you were meant to follow. Let's get into substance use and trauma. What inspired you to become a substance use or trauma specialist? You did mention a little bit earlier that you were kind of placed in that, or how did it work?
Yeah. So I mean, I personally encountered trauma, substance use all throughout my life. Not only I've seen it how it has been used negatively. I've
Mm,
seen it from both ends, right? I've seen it where there's people in who are not only the user but the provider. So I've
mm,
seen all aspects of just the how substances can impact a society, how it impacts a family, how it just impacts an individual. It impacts who we are, who we think we are, and not only that, but just the battle that it is. I think really when I came to Christ, I figured like, yeah, this is a physical battle that people, but it's also a very spiritual battle. So when
mhm,
I finished, I did some work with different students, like I said, and I also did work in a shelter, and then I went into residential treatment center work. So I worked with adolescents in residential centers, and I just saw a lot of snippets of like, man, I remember this. I remember this. Like, it's not that they're an addict. It's not like I could really relate in that transference of like, no, I remember being that kid, and I remember bonding over alcohol when somebody died. I remember throwing alcohol on the floor. Like that's something that growing up in the hood, that is normal. Like it's not so these certain things that I felt like I could relate to, I could understand, especially when you look at things culturally. When I had Hispanic clients come in, or who, it was kind of like, well, we drink at every party, and if you don't drink, then you're made fun of, or you. So understanding these different dynamics, that's what really like got me into the substance use, working at the residential center, and then just started integrating it in everywhere, because no matter if somebody is using, somebody is, out of everybody, somebody is affected by substance use in their life. And that's on whether they admit it or not, right? Because that's something that I feel is still very taboo to even talk about.
Which is what?
Like even the fact that you have an issue with substance use, or that you know somebody who, I mean, sometimes in a relationship, if your partner is struggling, you're less likely
Mhm.
to tell your family, because you can forgive your partner, but your family, especially, different communities, we react different. Different families are different. My family, they're gonna bring it up 5 years from now. I'll remember when, and it's, you may forget. You want to move past. So a lot of
Mhm.
times we stay in these secrets. We stay in like not reaching help. That's one way, but also it's taboo with like work. That's the biggest thing. A lot of people fear that, and it's just not knowing your rights, not knowing what is out there for you, not knowing you can get free treatment, which leaves people just like in denial of like how big this issue is, on not understanding that there's help for them, in the fear of protection for their family, fear and protection for themselves as well.
Yeah.
So I think really like working at the residential center is what brought it to where I started integrating it into a lot of work, because I just think it can be, addiction is something that goes beyond substances. We can
Mhm.
all struggle with an addiction, whether it's social media, whether it's just if we want to call it out or not. And if we want to excuse it, we could justify it, but it's when something is taking a forefront in our life or affecting our day to day.
Well, so actually that this question is a little further down the line, but you just gave an answer, I think, for it, right? Is at what point is substance use considered a disorder or disease? Because you mentioned the fact that people don't mention it because sometimes they don't even think it's a problem, right? Well, just having a
Mm-hmm.
beer or two before bed every night, but it's every night and you don't realize that it's necessary for you, right? So could you give us that definition, or like when it is considered something that's a disorder or disease?
Yeah, I mean, when you go into a treatment center, like they'll do, a biopsychosocial like assessment and seeing how much do you drink, how often, when. I would really say for anybody who's just like concerned, right? Not, maybe you don't have insurance, maybe you can't go get an assessment. If you stop this substance and you notice that your body is having effects to it, you're experiencing headaches, you're experiencing tremors, you're kind of twitching, like your hands may be shaking, or that's telling you like your body has become dependent on something outside of it. Your body, we were created with, everything that we need. This is outside of anybody. I mean, if you're needing insulin, if you're needing something to live that you've been prescribed, this is completely outside of that, just so it doesn't get taken out of context. But if you are taking a substance and it is getting to that point to where your body has become dependent, your body's going to tell you, your body's going to talk to you in those ways. It's going to start reacting. And many times, if with alcohol, we'll use to make those symptoms go away. Or it may not even be the physical symptoms where your body's talking, but your body may be talking through like what you're experiencing emotionally, right? Because even when we experience our somatic symptoms that come out, when we're feeling a lot of grief, we're feeling anger, our body, we're gonna feel it in our chest, you're gonna feel. So even if you notice you stop drinking and you're feeling that, a lot of times that's where drinking, or that's where, we'll use marijuana, we'll use meth, we'll use these different substances, because it's like, nah, I need to numb that. Something's coming up and it needs to go away, because we don't know how to. A lot of times in these situations, people weren't taught how to regulate themselves, and it's scary, when we're not taught how to deal with these big emotions. It gets scary because the fear of like what could happen. So that's where sometimes it's very common that we see like functional alcoholics. We see people who are utilizing substances and they're functional, and these are not like, I don't want the assumption to be that these are people who don't have careers. These are people who, are what we could say in prison, or these are people. No, these are, yes, some of those people as well, but these are people like you and I, who doctors, lawyers, like these are people who have careers, and who there's ways of just numbing the reality of what they deal with. They're doing very great things, but it's also very hard, very intense things. And sometimes these things can happen as well from things that we're prescribed to actually help us, where our body becomes dependent. I think that was a question too, but like substance use just overtakes us to where it's not something that sometimes you're just too far in, right? And it's not that something tells you like, oh, to try this, or pushes you. Sometimes trauma pushes you, but sometimes it's just exploration. You try something and you're hooked from that one instant. Your body's trying to meet that reward system again and again.
Yeah, so the answer to that question reminds me of like what I said in the intro, how I had or grew up with uncles who were drunk almost all the time. And on both sides of the family. So it's not, it's not like it just happened with one uncle. It was like I had several uncles on either side of the family. And I think for sure with them it had to do with trauma, but then I think back to my exes who were in high school and their substance of choice was meth, and they were really young when they started. Marijuana was a gateway drug for them because that's what they did initially, and then they went all the way to meth and other substances, I imagine, later on in their lives. So um I get, yeah, to clarify, I guess trauma doesn't always cause substance use or addiction.
Yeah, and it can play a big part. But there's also, I don't know if you want to go into that now, or
No, you
you want
can, yeah, go ahead.
to wait. I do think so. That's one thing where I think when I approach this, I approach it from an integrative perspective, where I don't separate the trauma and the substance use. A lot of times in treatments, it's very rare that you find dual diagnosis programs.
Mm.
Most of the times you go in and they're focusing just on your substance use, or they're going to focus just on your behavioral health, your trauma. And that's something that is hard, because if you're just tackling one, once the other one comes back, they're just coinciding, they're playing ping pong with each other. Like, you got to take the balls away from both and tackle both of them, which sometimes it can be confusing because the work overlaps, right? Some
Mm.
of the symptoms may overlap to where it's kind of like, okay, is this alcohol, or is this mental health, like what's happening throughout the body. um, but I think with trauma, when people experience trauma, it definitely can have that generational impact of how that's going to affect the body and what that looks like. And I think that's something for people to remember, is like, not only is it the trauma that's happening, but it's also the generation. Like, when we think of generational curses, right, I integrate the Christian perspective throughout my therapy. So when I think of generational curses, like, I see this person not only battling physically, emotionally, but they're battling spiritually as well. And that's where sometimes, I know in my family, like, alcohol is something that was normalized throughout generations. So it's like, to be that one that, or somebody that in the family that breaks that, it's kind of like it's all new. Now you're walking on new territory. Um, and even with trauma, that when that looks different to people, something me and you could experience the same situation, but it can affect us differently. Whereas it may feel traumatic to you, but I may be like, that's, that happened to me last year. And that's something that a lot of things, especially one thing I critique a lot, is the ACEs, which is heavily used a lot, the ACEs. But the ACEs does not look at the other side of, like, yeah, I may have went through all this shit, but I had a strong grandmother. I had a strong, like, my mom was really strong, like, just led this with strength, to where the resilience in me, it doesn't take into consideration the resilience. So that's something to take into account as well. Like, yes, we can go through stuff, we've been through stuff, but not forgetting, like, the strength that came through that. You know what I mean? And what built us for what we went through. Because it's easy to get caught up in, I think, in the trauma and those
Mm.
responses, the symptoms.
Yeah. So it's a case by case basis, I imagine, then, because some people do go through all of these childhood adverse experiences, which was another question on here. I love that you're just hitting upon them so organically. A lot of people do go through all these childhood adverse experiences, but there's no resilience built. But then they struggle even more, or they victimize themselves, and there's a lot of trauma there that needs to be unpacked. Maybe not even acknowledged, but on the other end, I do love that you mentioned that, like, yeah, my mom was a badass and she got us through all of the shit that we went through. And that made me stronger, or that much more stronger, because I watched her go through all of this
Mm-hmm.
crap too. And we went alongside it, or we went through it together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that I mean I've noticed in my own life is like the resilience, like no matter what you have gone through, there is some form of resilience that is created. No matter how hard things are, how hard they seem, there is some form of resilience that you are still here today.
Mhm.
Um, because everything, and I know this is pretty cliche, right? Like what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And sometimes it does feel like we die through these experiences.
Mhm.
Sometimes it does feel, but there's also like for me spiritual like a rebirth in that, like okay, I'm through this, like I'm how do we
Mhm.
die, and that's the biggest thing as a Christian. It's like how do we die to our old self, but I still want to remember, I still want to hold on to my trauma because that's became a part of my identity. I can give everything to Christ, but if I give you that, then where am I now? Because
Mhm.
that's how I've learned how to survive because of
Yeah.
this trauma. So that's something that I think therapy helps to realize that, like, even though you process through this and you're no longer responsive to it, that doesn't mean you're like letting go and gonna forget it. Because I think that's the body's fears. We're gonna forget how to survive anymore. But the only thing that we're doing is processing to where we're not reactive in this constant survival state, but we still have these same values. We still have these same, the same resilience factors. It's just a matter of like our mind understanding that.
Yeah. So your body's not always in fight or flight mode using these coping mechanisms that you had to develop along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we're mentioning the word trauma a lot. And I know that since 2020, a lot of people have been throwing around the word trauma on social media. And, the pandemic put mental health on the spotlight after having been socially distanced, or let's be real, like isolated from people because we're still doing Zoom stuff. And um, can you give us a definition for what is considered trauma in the mental health community?
Yeah, I mean, trauma is really anything adverse that you experience, right? Anything that is a difficult experience for you, a difficult situation that you encounter. Now there's big T's and there's little T's. There's something you can encounter that's small, and then there's something that you can encounter like a death or something that is much larger. The effects of it are determined, like that's where we have PTSD come in and different things on how long the effects of the trauma you experience last.
Mhm.
There's some people who, especially if you have been through a lot of trauma, sometimes you become so desensitized to things, to where it's no longer affecting you in that same way, but that doesn't mean that you're not affected by it. And just from, I mean, my own personal experience growing up, like going through, I was in a drive-by in high school, and one of my best friends was murdered, and
Mhm.
witnessing that and seeing it. But when you start to talk about things and you become so desensitized to, like, I can tell the story, and but that's after like trials and all of these things, right? And recounting and saying it so many times that, like, you learn to desensitize the emotions from it. And that's something that growing up in the hood, that's normal. People die, people see things, and they're so desensitized to it, but that doesn't mean that the trauma isn't there. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
that when we start doing some deep internal work, some of these emotions are going to come up, and some of these things are going to come up that have never been there. And especially after doing some of that work, you may notice, like, I'm able to talk about that and I'm not crying anymore. I'm able to, like, that's where healing, healing has taken place. Like your body is no longer becoming reactive.
Mhm.
So trauma does look different. I would keep in mind, like, there's a big T, there's a little T. Let's see. Like I said earlier, we can all experience like the same situation, but we're affected differently. And a lot of that is connected to like perception of what happened, our perception and how we internalize that. Because during that fight, flight, or freeze, we also have some, sometimes when people experience trauma, they black out. They don't remember nothing. They disassociate from the entire event. Some people can remember every single detail and feel it in their body and smell exactly what they experienced. So it's a very broad range of what that looks like. And I would say it's very easy to get stuck into the loop of re-traumatization. And that's
Mhm.
something that I think throughout my practice that I try to steer away from, because it's when we're going to therapy, we're seeking this healing. It's like, I know that I had this trauma and I need to heal from it, and But let's say you're no longer having these somatic experience where you're not affected, your body's not affected by it, right? You're not having nightmares, you're not having this, but we keep talking about the event and we keep having you relive it. We're re-traumatizing you and having you re-go through
Mm.
that when the work has already been done. And that's something that, just like this grind culture that happens, I would say that's something that's been real big of the healing and what does it look like, and when is it enough healing? Like, not so much when is it enough healing, but how do we learn to put things down and accept, like, sometimes we're not going to get the closure that we have envisioned, right? But it's accepting where that's at, which that can, I feel like the re-traumatization can be dangerous. And then, as I mentioned earlier, like how trauma becomes a part of our identity and that fear, um, as far as like letting stuff go. And it's hard because I hear you how you're saying, like, in 2020, like, trauma is just thrown around, and there's a lot of words that have been just like thrown around, and it's like, oh, everybody's a narcissist, or you're a, and it's like, yeah, and it's good that the information's coming out, it's good that the awareness is happening, but it's very important to make sure that, like, it's being diagnosed by a professional, it's being diagnosed, because it's easy for us to, we can finesse anything, how it can be subjective, and somebody, just in a conversation, we can finesse things to manipulate it. And you mentioned, like, victim mentality, I believe, right? You mentioned that earlier. And sometimes I have a, like, my belief, like, that's a lot connected when that becomes a part of our identity. If you're telling me to put that down or you're telling me to let that go, it's kind of like, who am I now? But to somebody who's already healed from it, it's like you just want to be the victim, or you just want to, like, you want to stay stuck in that. But their specific story can be very different on what, just how their brain is processing it. So I think the biggest thing is, like, us just being able to give grace and understanding, even though we may not agree. It's okay to disagree. Like, there's been many times where it's like, okay, like, we experienced the same thing, but it wasn't that bad. But when we sit there and we exchange stories, I'm like, oh, I can see why this is very bad to you, because you grew up in a what's considered normal. You grew up in a normal household. You grew up where, when you grow up in dysfunction, and there's a little more tolerance on dysfunction. So understanding that as I got older and in the professional settings, it kind of made a little more sense to where, let me not pass that judgment on, somebody's trauma, or comparing, because sometimes we tend to do that, especially with substance use. That's a big thing. Glorifying. It could be like, you went through one thing, oh, well, I went through this bigger thing, let me tell you about this. And it
To
tends
one
to
up.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned so much amazing stuff in this little time frame, but I want to backtrack it a little bit to how you mentioned that there's re-traumatization that can occur too when you're bringing stuff to therapy. How would one who is in therapy kind of come to the realization of, yeah, I went through this really traumatic experience, so I don't really need to mention it in therapy anymore because it's no longer affecting me? Like, what if in your mind it's something that you really have to let out because it's such a huge trauma, but you're not
Mm-hmm.
realizing, or you're not connecting the dots, that it's not really affecting your life anymore?
I think, transparency with a therapist is great, because as a therapist, we're trained to, like, extract, right? Especially when you first start therapy, we're going to extract everything that you give, just so that we get a clear, like, understanding of what's going on. And sometimes, what may be like, when we think of how dysregulation happens, right, or how someone's body is affected, to a therapist, we could be interpreting it as like, oh, this seems like this would be highly effective. But that's where that being able to answer, like, not answer, but being able to speak and use your voice, as far as saying, like, no, I'm actually not affected by that. And sometimes that can be scary, as far as going in these a professional setting and feeling like, with the doctor, being able to be just straight up with them, being real, and that sometimes is scary, especially like when, think of it like a doctor. You go see a doctor, and they tell you, hey, this is wrong with you. And even though you haven't been feeling that, it's like, okay, that's what's wrong with me. So it's very, we just kind of take it as like that is true. So, and that's something that it's hard. I know this, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. Like, it's hard to use your voice in those settings. And I've seen that transfer into like therapy settings, to where if I ask something and I'll tell them, like, hey, we're in a boat, like we're in the waters, but you're the captain, like you're driving this. If there's ever something that it's like, I don't want to talk about that, I give them the autonomy to respect that. Because even if we're processing trauma and we're going through stuff and you're having an important birthday dinner tonight, we've already opened up all this. Like, I like to be aware of everything the client's experiencing, because then I'm opening all this stuff up in the morning. They're going to be exhausted and they're probably not going to be able to enjoy that night. So being able to tell your therapist all of that, like, hey, I have something, this isn't a good day to work through it. And sometimes we got to be aware, because that could be avoidance. Like, your therapist will challenge you, like, is it you avoiding or is that true? So, but with the re-traumatization, really asking, really saying, like, well, I guess noticing your body, like, are you affected? Are these memories still coming up? Is it affecting your work? Is it affecting your sleep, your eating, anything like that? If all of those answers are no, then most likely that is something that, yes, it happened to you and that's a part of your story, but it's not your identity. You know what I mean? And when we realize that shift, it's like, I can carry that as my story and it's not something that I need to fully process through. And sometimes I'll notice that it can come up to where they're making the connection, but that doesn't mean they're fully processing. It's okay to make the connection still and us not go deep, but being aware of the re-traumatization. If you feel like you're no longer affected by something, and as a therapist, I'm thinking, hey, this is a, this is probably something she needs to process in depth. When I start picking and we start going deeper and deeper, that re-traumatization can happen, to where now we're putting your body back in those feelings, we're putting your body back in those spaces and back in those memories. So I think that's important to be aware of, and even sharing that with your therapist. Like, hey, now that we're talking about this, I'm having nightmares. And your therapist should be able to, drive the conversations or drive your treatment plan forward from that.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned the transparency piece also, because especially in the Latino community, right? No sacamos los trapitos sucios al aire con nadie. So, like, first of all, getting us into therapy is like a huge feat. But then once we're there, it's like, well, I don't know this person. Why am I going to tell them every single thing? And so we like reserve some things because of shame. So, like, there's a lot of vergüenza that goes behind it,
Yeah.
or like, no conozco esta persona. Why am I going to tell? It's
Yeah.
so many different little things where, we have to be totally transparent if we really want to do the deep work of healing and then getting out of whatever traumas that we've gotten, so that we can become the best version of ourselves. So thank you for mentioning that transparency piece. I think it's really, really important for anybody, regardless of the culture that you're coming from, to be open. And, we're, as therapists, we're not here to judge anything that you've been through in your life or that you've done. We're just there to help you work through your shit so that you can heal and become the ideal version of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. That's good. That's good. And I think
Yeah.
one thing I do for myself is I ask myself, like, okay, is this me? Why am I feeling unsafe? Because a lot of that goes to us feeling unsafe, so even just asking yourself, like, what is it about this situation? Sometimes it could be the therapist. So if you notice that, like, every time you're meeting with this person, your body is just cringing, or that's probably not a good fit for you, and that's okay. Like, your therapist feelings should not get hurt, and if they do, then it's good. You kind of got away. You should be able to have that conversation and do that, and even
Yeah.
practicing sometimes at home, like, what you're gonna say.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes therapists remind you of your parents or people in your life that didn't make you feel safe, and it's completely fine to feel that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so let's go. We went through the trauma. Now we want to like merge them together and with substance use. Have you in your work noticed if there's any biological sex differences in how trauma impacts whether one becomes addicted to a substance or not?
Yeah. So I definitely believe they go hand in hand. You know, I do believe there's a difference, and especially when we consider like testosterone, we consider estrogen like throughout the body. Also, body composition from men to women. It is, substances are going to affect us differently. That's just the reality. And when I integrate, like, I guess when we think of like biological sex differences on how the trauma impacts us, even when we think of experiences, right? We think of two siblings and they can go through something traumatic, a boy and a girl, and they're going to process that. They're going to hold that in. Their body's going to hold that in a different way. And sometimes it's very common for like males to disassociate through that. It's very common in therapy that we like there's even with childhood experiences, maybe they don't remember a lot of their childhood. They've suppressed a lot of the trauma that's happened. So they're not affected to that extent. But once you start
Mhm.
doing some more of that deep work, a lot of that stuff comes up to the surface.
Mhm.
But with the substance use, are you wondering like on the effects that it has with them? Does it have effects on them using, or is it like more so with when they use the substance?
So my question is if there's a difference between whether trauma would lead either biological sex to substance use more than the other one.
Hmm. Okay. Um. Mm, so that's a little tricky, right? Because we have
Mm.
everything is subjective. So there are researchers who believe that, right? And we always hear like marijuana is the gateway drug. Like you use marijuana and you're gonna use everything. That's what we've just been taught even throughout our studies. But I do think the experiences of trauma, as we process them differently, sometimes substances are used to mask those. They're used to suppress them. They're used so that someone can function in their day to day. That's where we have a lot of functional users, right? We have people who go to work, they live a normal life, but they heavily use. Um, when I integrate my beliefs, I integrate that in there. I believe that there's a stronghold component that must be taken into consideration. So when there's generations and generations before you who have struggled with a substance use, who have struggled with these strongholds of substance use, like the enemy doesn't want you to be the first one to not use. The enemy doesn't want that. So the trauma that you've experienced through generations and generations plays upon that as well, and the substance use. But can I say like one? There's been research that I'm sure it's been subjective, but in my personal opinion, do I believe that a traumatic incident is can push you into like using a substance? It can, but in the right environmental setting, right? Like if you go through something and you're in a remote area, you're not going to say like, "Hey, I need to use marijuana right now. I need to." Like your body's not going to react that way. Your body's not going to desire this unless you've utilized a substance before. Your body knows, "Hey, when we need to get out of reality, this is where we go." But if you've never used that, I don't believe, and this goes contra. Like I said, somebody can argue this because there is the genetical component that researchers have found, right? That there's different chromosomes or neural circuits that are in the brain that are believed to like make one at higher risk for addiction. But we also have to take into consideration that's only taking on one piece. That's not saying is there something that can combat that. If you have a loving grandma, does that mean you're not at higher risk no more? Like so that's where when we see these things we have to be very subjective and like they can go different ways. Same thing with the aces. The aces can say, hey, if you score at a high level here, you're 1,000% more likely to commit suicide, or you're this much. And the reality is like maybe you didn't even experience that. You checked off every box, but you didn't experience that. You had a loving grandmother. I keep using my grandma because I love my grandma. She was a good
Mhm.
important piece of my life, but they don't take that into consideration. So
Mhm.
it leaves a lot of that confusion left open, I think, for us to not know and to place these kind of labels on ourselves to where like, well, I'm more likely for this. And when we feel that that's what we're destined to, a lot of times we're more likely to give it a chance or give it a try. And sometimes it happens where somebody just uses, they try something one time and their body is just hooked from what it
Mhm.
does, what it releases, that reward that it, sends off to the brain, dopamine that's released, like they're wanting that reward system again, and their brain is desiring those same feelings. They'll try again, they'll use a substance again. It doesn't activate the same reward system is activated, but it's kind of like that first time you use, your brain is like a bell rings this high, right? Like your sensation is so high. When you use again, it's never going to go this high, but your body is always like, no, 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 no. Like I needed a little, like we are wanting to reach that same level of euphoria. Like we're wanting to reach that same level of ecstasy. That's probably a better word. And that's where the continuous use comes in, to where then now your body becomes dependent on it. um, and I know a question here is like, is it a disease? I believe that substance use is a disease. That's something else that people can be subjective upon, to where it's more of a choice. But I think there's fine lines to where when the body is dependent and you see somebody, withdrawing, somebody detoxing to where they can go into cardiac arrest because their body is detoxing so bad. That's where you understand, like it's no longer a choice. And it's hard, right? Because it leads up in a choice. It's your first choice on to take that hit or not. But the effects of it, I think, they're a little more enhanced and different on what substances do actually to the brain.
Mm,
I
yeah.
gave you a lot, so I hope I covered your
So
question.
yeah, you covered the question and beyond. So I guess let's go into the therapy room now with substance use. What I'm gonna mix the next three questions together because I think they're reworded and they all go one with the other. So what is the
Okay.
work that you do in addressing substance use in your therapy session to help then change or shift the narrative in somebody's life? Like what modalities work best whenever, I mean, in your therapy
Yeah.
room or office?
Yeah, so I integrate I shouldn't say a little bit, because I integrate a lot of different things like motivational interviewing, some strengths based, DBT work, also just regular talk therapy, but also integrating some of that EMDR whenever I can. But I truly feel like I can't even take credit for anything, because it's the work of especially with substance use, it's the work of the client, on where they're at and what their capacity, what they can do. And I think that's the big, like, misunderstanding, which I would say that I've felt before, like with family members, like, why can't they just get sober for me? Like, where it connects to like, why am I not, I don't understand how you can't put your family first. But it's deeper than that, right? When we talk about the effects that it has on the body, when we talk about the brain, and when individuals make that decision, a lot of times we do see relapses that happen. We do see those are a part of the process. This is not something that some people can go cold turkey, and they do. So it can happen. It is possible, but it's also situation. Everybody has different situations that they're encountering, whether it's the family dynamics, workplace dynamics, and especially the environment. Maybe they want to get sober, but the people they live with provide it. So it's hard to get sober. So throughout therapy, it's really meeting them where they're at. I figure out like what is not figure out, but ask them about like what are the environmental impacts, who's your support system, and a lot of times it's hard when you don't have any support system, because we all, like, when we're working towards a goal, that support system helps us to keep pushing us. So when you don't, that's where these AA groups, celebrate recovery, these different groups like that, they become an important aspect. And I will integrate some of the work that they do throughout AA as well. And not that I'm taking on their sponsor lead or anything, but if some of that work they need to process further in depth, this is a safe space where they can do that. Or if they're noticing some triggers are happening through that, I open that up as well. But I would say it's all on an individualized approach, especially when you think of what level you're at. If you're coming in for just regular therapy, or if I'm seeing you in a residential center, or for like inpatient groups, they look very different on what your needs are.
Mm, okay. I know a lot of people who say substance use work is very difficult because of how many times people relapse. Um, what message do you have for on both ends of the spectrum or on either side, right? For people who suffer from substance use so that they don't become discouraged on their journey, as well as people who do work in these environments who have to provide the mental health services for people who will tend to relapse every once in a while.
Hmm. I think as somebody who is entering treatment, I would definitely say like, yeah, it's hard. It's gonna happen. Anybody who sits here and can tell you like a relapse is not gonna happen or a lapse is not gonna happen, that's just not being realistic. You know, I've had clients who sometimes it happened on accident. You know, somebody poured them wine and they didn't even know they had wine. Like, so there's these things that like they can happen and they can stumble you, but like you keep going. You figure out like what can I control in this moment, and every day is a new day, every hour is a new hour. I think that's the biggest thing that can keep people in this cycle, is like the shame that comes with it, feeling like there's nowhere to go because there's just so much shame on what we've done in the past or even how we're handling it. But just taking that step, you know, keep putting one foot in front of the other. Even if you fall, just keep putting one foot in front of the other. You know, and when you go, like if you go to seek treatment, what's the worst that could happen? Like you get sober. You know, that's the way I always see it. I saw that at a quote when I worked at Phoenix House. Like I saw that on a quote on a wall that a kid said, and I'm just like, you know what, that's right. Like I mean, obviously, like when we get technical, right, I have to be considerate of like we're on social media. So just making sure nothing is taken out of context. Yes, when we think of what's the worst, somebody could die, because the reality is residential centers aren't 100% safe either, right? You're going somewhere where you meet somebody where they have access to substances, or they're the, you know, sometimes they're the plug, and there's connections. So I do want to be sure that like I'm hitting on the reality of what the world is, but also being able to just tell somebody to like have grace with yourself, and just really, when you make that change on, you want to do it for you, that's when real change happens. Because we can want
Mm-hmm.
to do things for everyone else so much, but there's too many people that we want to please at once. But when we want to please ourselves, the game changes, is different. um
Yeah.
and as far as like with you said, as far as therapists thinking like the work is too hard, I think I noticed early in my career on like when that savior mentality comes in, when I'm doing too much of the work, and I notice like, oh, I'm trying to pull all this information and you're not really even working with, I'm not doing my part as a therapist. I'm trying to play that savior role where like I'm going to help you get sober. I can't do that. I can walk this
Mm-hmm.
journey with you on the side of you, but I can't walk in front of you, and you know I can't walk behind you. Like I can walk on the side of you until you're ready. Then I can walk behind you, and that's where that maintenance stage comes in. You may have clients come in later to see you once a year, every 6 months. Um, but I would definitely, I always say like heart check. I'll heart check myself and see like where's my heart in it. Like why do I want to know this, or why am I pushing so much? Because sometimes we'll have a transference that we're not even aware of. Maybe this person reminds you of your brother who drank or who used, and there's this transference of like, if you just did this, right? But it's very important when we're feeling that way to just like drop it, like drop it all and see like what is the client needing. Because ultimately our care should be person focused around the client, you know. So really dropping that and being able to heart check ourselves, and I think it goes with a lot of humbling. Like we're not God, and when we try to have that savior mentality, that's where we think we're the ones healing them, and the clients hold the power. They're doing the healing. They're doing the inner work. We're just kind of helping provide that space and guiding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're just shedding little lights on things that need to be
Yeah.
fixed, and that's it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I guess I want to step into substance use and the Latino community or the Latinx community. Um, I wonder if you see any correlation, excuse me, between substance use and machismo, if at all.
Mhm. I don't. I mean, I would say more like I think they go hand in hand on like societal expectations, because when you think of, even when you think of a machismo, right? What you think of, it's these expectations that are placed on men. These there's strong and just like, like, I don't know. I'm like comparing to machismo with my own family, but it's like, we just kind of like like they know everything, and it's just, and that's not the reality, right? When we think of things, but it's just like these men that we see them, and the respect, the like these, I don't know how to explain it with words. But I do think that's more societal expectations that I'm putting on these men. It's not
Mm-hmm.
something that these men woke up and said like, yes, I'm gonna be machismo, but it's something that's expected. So like these shoes that are placed that like they're filling. They sometimes they may feel they have to fill them. And a lot of times I think in the Latino community we see like men as the providers, men at home, or women work. A lot of that is shifting now, right? We see a lot of the gender roles shifting and stuff, but there's still these, we have to think, when we think of generations, there's still these strongholds of like, this is how it should be, this is what should happen. And I think even with substance use, when we think, I keep comparing to alcohol, but it could be anyone. I think alcohol is the main one that I see. Like you see it at parties, no matter what kind of party it is, right? Alcohol is there. And it's just drinking. It's more of a social thing. It's more of a bonding thing that is utilized. And a lot of times I'm thinking like, with my grandfather, like worked all week, but then on the weekend he would drink. And it's not that he was a belligerent drunk, not that he was abusive, not. So when you really look at it, it's like, okay, what harm is being caused externally, but it's more of the harm internally that he was probably unaware of. So I do think like gender roles placed in the Latino community make a difference on that, on the expectations that we have of each other. I honestly think like sometimes we are our worst enemy. Like we do this, we have these expectations and these gender roles that are set upon ourselves that it's hard to break it, right? It's hard to decolonize that and see it from a different lens when we don't even know what does that look like, and what does that feel like. And that's where sometimes, I mean, when there's a guy, let's say on the outside, externally, he seems like machismo, right? But let's say he doesn't come off that way, right? Maybe he's more feminine. It's very like different on like understanding, but it's because these assumptions are being placed on someone based on how they look or how we expect them to act. A lot of times in the family, well, I'm speaking for my own family. Being like, like the men, it was assumed that they should work hard, they should do these certain things, whereas the women like would clean up after the man or serve the food, and that's something that I've noticed like in my own life. I work, and but I'm still like serving my husband first, and I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, so it's these things that subconsciously like we pick up on, that we don't understand how to really break them. And even the whole machismo, when we think of machismo, right, it just thinks of these things, that these assumptions that are placed. But I feel like that's really difficult for me to. I would really like to hear like a man's perspective on that, on what that feels like, having to be placed with this standard, right? Of like, what is a machismo, or how tough are you? How tough can you be? And how do you truly feel that you're living up to that? Because I've noticed that throughout therapy, I've seen like, especially with Latino men, even in my own family, it's like those expectations that we place on the men travel throughout, even in their own family, where the feelings of being a provider. So if they come up short from anything than that, it's very hard for them to find their identity sometimes, because they've placed it so much on these like societal expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that made sense. And then I know it kind of went. Okay.
No, no, yeah, it made perfect sense. I guess the next question I have is, how often have you seen substance show up in your therapy office as a result of intergenerational trauma from like the Latino perspective?
Oh yeah. I mean, a lot based on just like what is normal. Like sometimes I think it's, and I don't want to see. I want to be very clear on how I'm saying this too, because I don't want to make the assumption that all Latinos are. When I'm saying Latinos, all Latinos are Latinos, right? I am I am Chicana. I was raised in East Austin. I was raised so when I speak on that, or I'm speaking from my own personal experience. because I'm sure if I was first gen here, my experience would be a little different on what that looks like. So from my experience on what I encountered, I would definitely say that there's a correlation from substance use and the gender roles, just based on like generation. Well, you mentioned intergenerational trauma, like I mentioned with those strongholds. In my family, there was alcohol used throughout the generations to where it finally came to, like it's a problem. And I think my mom was the one who noticed, like, hey, this isn't like, and she stopped. And then it kind of passed on to, like, I'm not saying that I have never drank or anything, but it's to where she became aware of like what are triggers. She became aware of like her boundaries of how much consumption can she use to where it was. And that's the thing, like, people don't understand that you don't have to get rid of, so like completely be sober. Some people do, but not everyone. And that's where it's more about learning, like, okay, what are those triggers for you to where it takes you out of your cognitive ability to function, to where you are out of control. That's where the danger zones come in for people. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of it is connected to just the generational trauma that we've experienced, those strongholds that have been placed on our family, and the unknowing on how do we walk through new ground, like how do we break these things, how do we function without these coping skills that have been used, because sometimes substances become such a coping skill that they're passed on through generations, right? We see smoking marijuana can be used as one, where if the parent smokes, they smoke in the house around the kids. So once the kids are not even of age, but when they can, they're a teen, they may start smoking with them. And it's not so much that it's not seen as a negative thing in that household. It's not seen. And I think being able to understand I don't even know if it would be cultural differences or just differences within every family dynamic, no matter your race, no matter, we're all raised different in the expectations. And it's having a safe person to be able to say, like, hey, I know that's normal in your family, but that's not healthy. That can be harmful. And I did find something that was interesting where it talked about how like the assimilation that happens like for families that come from Mexico and are living here and working in the United States, like raising their family, speaking a new language, even the education, like, and just to where they assimilate like the acculturation to like alcohol consumption, and that being normalized or that being expected after a hard day's work. So I was interested to like see how, I'm pretty sure that that has some sort of effect, because that's traumatic in it, excuse me, that's traumatic in itself, right? Like going to a different country, and I can't even say like I know, but what that looks like on the experiences to get here. Like I can't even say that I relate to that because I've never done that, but I can only imagine like the trauma that comes from that and the
Yeah.
undisclosed trauma, because like you mentioned, a lot of that's not talked about in the community, and especially out of fear. Like if they do share these secrets, or they do share what happened, what could happen then to them. um so I thought that that was pretty like interesting to hear, because I think that that's something that should kind of be at the forefront when we think of like the Latino community. Kind of how does that affect, like, right, us assimilating to what American standards are, what that looks like.
Yeah. So you're saying then that so assimilation and acculturation are two different things. Acculturation is you're grasping things from the American culture, but still keeping things from whatever home country you came in. And assimilation means, for the most part, you're leaving behind your culture, which happens more with the further generations than it does with the immigrants. But yeah, you're basically just taking on the American culture once you're here, and then releasing whatever comes with the culture that you came from or emigrated from with. And so just to clarify, you're saying that people who migrate into the United States, they're adapting this new uh they're adapting this like mentality of, I'm just drinking a beer to like wind down from the day from the United States.
Well, and that's the thing. Thank you for clarifying on the assimilation. I knew I used those interchangeably. That's the thing of like I didn't do. I mean, this isn't my field of expertise as far as on that, but I'm thinking like I'm pretty sure that that has something to do with like the expectations, right? Or what does that look like? I don't know. I mean, that was something in my family that being my grandpa, when he, he was here and his family came from Mexico, and that was something that he did. Like, it was seen as normal. And was that something that was just seen as like an expectation? Is that something that would happen back home? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
where I think there's a big gap in what does that look like? Has that
Mm-hmm.
just been, is that American standard? Because I feel like that is what's kind of known, right? Like, you see these beer commercials and they're relaxing and but I couldn't say, like, I don't know if that's something that is standard throughout all practices. But I just found that in an article that I thought that was like, that's interesting. Like, if that, I don't know, like, if that does impact their alcohol consumption in any way.
Yeah, that would be a really good study to run if it hasn't already been researched, is like in other Latin American countries. Because a lot of the immigrants that we're seeing, at least here in Texas now, are mostly Central Americans along with Mexican immigrants. So it would be really interesting to do those studies and find out what the lifestyle is like, and if substance use or alcohol consumption, if we want to just stick to that, is a norm in those countries, or if it's something that was learned here and then became part of the acculturation or assimilation process. That's super cool. Thanks
Mm-hmm.
for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have any examples or stories, success story of someone that you worked with in session that was able to overcome their substance use that was related to some traumatic event in their life, or events, plural?
Yeah. Not some. I don't ever, just out of confidentiality, like, I don't connect to any of my clients, but I would say probably just the story of my mom. And I think just the fact of, like, how alcohol had impacted her throughout my childhood, and what I saw throughout that, the dysfunction that it caused.
Mm,
And just how, like I mentioned, once she learned, she went through her own process of healing and treatment, and, like, it just impacted the dynamics, the communication, trust, relationships, like, all of that was kind of lost beforehand. And after her treatment, like, I can say that now she just has an overall awareness of, like, her boundaries, insight, and even being, I feel like even her voice, like, she's able to speak out more, able to say different things, which I didn't even realize. Like I mentioned earlier, my family, like, will kind of throw jokes or bring stuff up, like, lay down the line, and it's just kind of like her being able to set those boundaries. It really impacted, kind of like, oh, okay, like, set a new understanding on me, and also brought some awareness to where, like, what I didn't realize, how alcohol had been such an impact. And I've seen the change on, like, family gatherings, like, where it went from everybody was turned up to a 10 to where, like, we're remembering and everybody's at a 3, but it's still okay. Like, you're remembering these things. And I think too, like, so that would be one. And I think a lot of my mom's change too happened when her relationship with Christ, and truly, like, giving that up, and dying to that, those ways and stuff.
mm,
So I'm always gonna, like, I don't know, integrate, my faith in that, because I just feel like that's done a lot on just where I'm going, and what things that I've been able to let go of throughout my family.
yeah. It sounds like your mom breaking that cycle kind of helped the rest of your family too, right? Not just you.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and like, everybody, I mean, we have our own journey, right? My family isn't too big. My mom, she only has me, so she did impact that to where, like, everybody else, I don't know about their own, like, alcohol use, but it has impacted just their view on, like, boundaries, or what is that, or saying things, on even what that looks like. Just because I think everybody knows her story and what she's been through. So just the process, the healing that's taken place, I think that's what's planted the most hope. And also, like, for her grandkids, like, they know a whole different side. They know a whole different person without that, right? Because there's not even they've never even seen that side. So it's just amazing to see, like, the transformation in seasons of our lives, like, things that we went through, and how we can put them down, and we don't have to pick them back up.
Yeah. Well, that explains why you're such a boss lady and the way that you show up, taking up space in all the places. That's awesome that your mom was an example, a positive example for you.
Yeah, she was.
Do you have any resources where people can seek substance use treatment or start to read about or listen to for help if they aren't ready to fully step into the therapeutic space for it?
Yeah, I mean, there's resources online on, I think it's a SAMHSA website. Like, there's so many different websites. There's AA. Even if you're not interested, let's say you've had a bad experience, just being real, that happens. I mean, there's different meetings online that you can go to and attend virtually, even if you feel like, is this for me? Is this not? I would say, if you have a family member who's using, there's also meetings for that as well. My mind just completely went blank on what the meetings are called, but they're not called AA. I'll figure it out. But there's also those group meetings that you can attend where it's other family members who have been impacted by somebody using substances, and it teaches you like how to set boundaries with them, how when to know like how not to be giving them money anymore, or just the unhealthy habits. So you start to hear from others and learning that, and also learning about the disease of addiction and what that looks like.
I think you're thinking of Al-Anon for AA.
Al-Anon. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was here like typing on my computer, like my
Yeah.
mind went blank.
No, it's okay. There's a lot of resources out there. And
Mhm.
I like that you mentioned the AA meetings that are virtual. As part of my program, I had to attend several so that I could see how
Oh,
group
nice.
was led. And I went to a Marijuana Anonymous, or I attended, I didn't go to because
Mhm.
it was in Long Beach. It was actually based out from Long Beach, California. So you
Oh,
don't have to
nice.
attend if your fear is running into somebody that you know here in Austin, like because of the pandemic. Now all of these are so available to us. You can definitely go on to Google and find AA meetings that are anywhere in the country, and you don't even have to show your face. You don't have to share your story. You just show up, hear other people's stories, and chips are still given or mailed out. It's a similar
Oh, nice.
experience, but you're not in a physical space with somebody. So I know that some people, fear the physical space because of judgment and
Mhm.
embarrassment and shame and everything that comes with substance use. So you do have that option that's virtual, and you can go to any state. One of them was in New York, the other one was in Long Beach, and I think the third one I attended was like from Colorado or something. So it was pretty cool.
Great. I
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
if also when you go, if you want to go like more faith-based route, they have the Celebrate Recovery. I'm not too sure if Celebrate Recovery does online or not,
Mm,
but many churches have those set up as well.
yeah. Yeah.
And there's
They
different,
do.
like you can either go through the AA book, or there's different books. I want to say it's a Smart Recovery, is another one where the God component is pulled out of it for someone who wants
Mhm.
to see like from more of a non-religious aspect through the AA program.
Yeah.
So that's an option for people as well. And if you're looking for, if you need help like getting into an assessment or anything like that, or even just getting screened, like to see like, do I have an issue, right? And somebody can ask you a bunch of questions and really help break things down for you. That doesn't mean you're going into treatment tomorrow. It just means like you're going to have a better understanding. Remember, you hold the power, the autonomy to say like, I don't want to go, unless you are being forced by law enforcement. That's different. But Cinecor is one where they do offer, like, there's a lot of state funding too. If somebody doesn't have the funds, a lot of these places take insurance. Integral Care is one that you can contact. You can just like Google their number, but Integral Care has like a crisis unit where they can come out. So if somebody is experiencing like withdrawal symptoms or just in a crisis, maybe they're in a psychosis mode from using psychosis, maybe they're, which that means like maybe they're seeing things, maybe they're hearing things, or you just don't know
Mhm.
what's going on from their substance use. That would be a good one to call because they have different connections as well to programs that can help detox or helping somebody get seen with medication or anything like that, meeting their basic needs and get them set up with some case management.
Would that be the same as MCOT, or is it a different
Yeah.
team?
So
Okay. Okay.
Integral Care is just the name of the entire like
Hmm.
organization, and then MCOT is the crisis unit that actually comes out and does those house calls.
My mobile crisis outreach team. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So is there anything else that you would like to share that hasn't been covered already about substance use and or trauma?
Um, no, I think that we've done a lot. I would say more for trauma, just like like I think really accepting like this is normal, and our body was designed and created. Our body was created specifically to respond in dangerous situations. So understanding that when your body is responding, it's because something's feeling dangerous or unsafe to it. And it could be an effect from trauma that you've experienced. Excuse me, it could be an effect from trauma that you've experienced. So really just being in tune with that rather than like trying to work through it or trying to cover up what you're experiencing, being more in tune on like allowing your body to process, and connecting with the therapist. I think that's the best route, just to help guide, like you mentioned earlier, like shining that light on like what is going on or what am I experiencing. And just knowing that like everybody deals with something. The only thing is whether they're going to admit it or not. But everybody has experienced some form of mental illness throughout their life, whatever that looks like, whether it's depression, anxiety, it's just more so acknowledging what that is and being able to deal with it in a healthy way, cope with it. And the same thing with substance use. I believe that everybody's been touched by substance use in some way, whether it was directly or indirectly. I think everybody can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, we've wrapped up the topic for the day. And I want to make sure that people are able to get in touch with you as well. So if you could share with us what where you practice, what modalities you're certified trained in, and then if there's any upcoming events that you're going to be a part of or how people get in touch with you via social media. I'll link all of this stuff at the bottom, but just so that you can advertise yourself as well.
Yeah, for sure. Um, as far as modalities, I would definitely say like I focus more on talk therapy with some integrative like EMDR trauma work. I do some skill building from some DBT work. Um, it looks different for everybody. Sometimes I'll utilize some motivational interviewing, which I think is very good on like just having a toolbox where we're gonna grab from different things. You can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Deserah Telles. That's on IG or Facebook. And then my website is www.telluscounseling.com. So like my last name, but instead it's Tell Us, so TELLUS counseling. And what I have going on, so in July, I'm actually going to be launching like a monthly study release, and that's going to be like a monthly journal that's more faith-based, integrated. And then also I have in a few months focusing another study that will be faith-based, focused on like inner child healing and some trauma work. So you can definitely like reach out through the website or message me on Instagram to get connected and just find out, learn more about what I'm doing or what we do over there at Tellus Counseling.
That's super awesome. And I think we're recording this episode just in time for the research
Yeah,
opportunity to come around. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for being on today and showing and sharing all of the wisdom that you have on this topic. I know there's so much more to be said. I could just, there's these are just questions that I put together and we could continue talking about this topic forever, but I think we covered a lot today, and so I totally appreciate that you came on, and let's see how many people we reach, right? Let's see how many people
yeah,
God leads us to with this episode.
yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. Don't you know what, and the work you're doing, don't get discouraged. Like you said, I think even if it's one person, even if it's not, the one thing is it may not be somebody today or tomorrow, but these are recorded. It could be somebody next year, and
Yeah.
the one message that you provide helps them to get the help that they need. So just
Yeah.
staying encouraged in that. You're doing good
Thank you
work.
so much for that. Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just looking forward to see what other collaborations I could do with other people and then maybe continue to do with you because you have expertise in so many different areas. So if you
Yeah,
could
for
mentor
sure.
me and take me under your wing, I will take me under your
Yeah,
wing. That
come
would be
on.
awesome.
Come.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again, and we'll be in touch.
Okay.
I really hope that y'all enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Thayes. I hope you felt her energy and how like amazing of a person and resilient of a person she is, as she mentioned. And yeah, so thank y'all for joining me. Remember to like the video or the audio on whatever platform you're listening, subscribe to my channel, and comment comment. That's the call to action for y'all, to comment any of the curiosities that y'all have about mental health or therapy, depression, about anxiety, about EMDR, questions that come up from other podcasts that you've already watched on Doses of Darling. If there is something that you need clarification on, definitely let me know in the comment section. Yeah. Thanks again. Muchas gracias. I will send you all off with some love, light, and many, many blessings.